At 74, I never imagined I would be standing in a courtroom, my hands trembling, my heart beating like it didn't belong to me anymore. The room felt too bright, too quiet, too final. After 52 years of marriage, it all came down to a few signatures, a few cold sentences, and a man I once loved looking at me like I was nothing more than a stranger. I kept staring at him, hoping foolishly that he would soften, that he would remember the life we built together, the children we raised, the nights we stayed awake worrying about bills and futures. But his face remained stiff, distant, almost impatient. When the judge asked if we had anything to say, I opened my mouth, but no words came out. What could I say after half a century of silence? He, on the other hand, spoke clearly. I want everything, he said, his voice steady, confident, as if he had rehearsed it. And somehow, unbelievably, he got it. The house I spent decades cleaning, decorating, turning into a home, it was no longer mine. The savings I helped build penny by penny, sacrificing my own needs for our family, they vanished from my reach. Even the car I never drove, but paid for through years of quiet support, was taken. I felt like my entire life had been erased in less than an hour. When we stepped outside the courthouse, the air felt colder than it should have. I held onto my worn handbag like it was the only thing anchoring me to reality. He stopped for a moment, turned to me, and looked me in the eyes for what felt like the first time in years. There was no regret there. No guilt. Only something sharp and cruel. Live with your pride now, he said. The words cut deeper than anything else. Then he walked away without looking back, his figure shrinking into the distance, taking with it everything I had ever known. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. There was no home waiting for me. No one expecting me. Just an overwhelming silence that wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I realized in that moment that I wasn't just divorced. I was alone in a way I had never been before. The kind of alone that echoes. That night, I found myself sitting on a cold park bench, clutching a single suitcase that held the fragments of my life. A few clothes, some old photographs, and a sweater that still smelled faintly of a home that no longer existed. The sky above me stretched endlessly, uncaring, while the world around me moved on as if nothing had changed. People walked past, laughing, talking, living their lives, while I sat there trying to understand how mine had fallen apart so completely. I kept reaching into my bag to check my phone, hoping to see a missed call or a message. My children knew about the divorce. They knew everything. I had convinced myself that they would call, that they would come find me, that they wouldn't let their mother sit alone like this. But the screen remained empty. Each time I checked, my hope shrank a little more. Hours passed, and the bench grew harder beneath me, the air colder against my skin. I tried to stay strong, telling myself this was temporary, that I would figure something out. But the truth was beginning to settle in. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have anywhere to go. I wasn't just homeless in the physical sense. I was homeless in every way that mattered. My past was gone, my future uncertain, and my present filled with a silence that felt unbearable. I watched the streetlights flicker on one by one, casting long shadows across the ground, and for the first time in my life, I felt invisible. Like I had disappeared, and no one had noticed. The first night on the street was the longest night I had ever lived through. The cold wasn't just physical, it seeped into my bones, into my thoughts, into my sense of self. I pulled my coat tighter around me, trying to preserve whatever warmth I could, but it was never enough. Every sound felt louder in the dark, the distant hum of cars, footsteps echoing on the pavement, voices drifting in and out of earshot. I couldn't relax, couldn't close my eyes for more than a few seconds. Fear kept me awake. Fear of someone approaching, fear of losing the little I had left, fear of not waking up at all. I had never known this kind of vulnerability. In my old life, I had a door to lock, a bed to crawl into, a sense of safety I had taken for granted. Now, I had nothing but open space and uncertainty. My mind kept replaying the past, searching for a moment where things could have been different, where I could have changed the outcome. But every memory led me back to the same place: years of silence, years of giving, years of shrinking myself until there was nothing left to protect. At some point, exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. Every small noise jolted me awake again. By the time the first light of morning crept over the horizon, I felt like I had aged another decade. My body ached, my eyes burned, and my spirit felt fragile. At 74, I wasn't supposed to be surviving nights like this. And yet, somehow, I had made it through. Barely, but I had. The next morning, as the city slowly came to life, I sat there trying to gather what little strength I had left. My hands were stiff from the cold, my thoughts scattered, my hope dangerously thin. That's when I noticed her, a young woman walking toward me with a quiet determination. She didn't look at me with pity or judgment, just a kind of gentle curiosity. Without saying much, she handed me a warm cup of tea. The heat seeped into my fingers, and for a moment, I forgot everything else. "You look like my grandmother," she said softly. Something about those words broke through the walls I had been holding up. I felt tears welling up before I could stop them. No one had looked at me with kindness since the divorce. No one had seen me as anything other than a burden or a stranger. She sat beside me, not asking questions, not demanding explanations, just being there. That simple presence felt like a lifeline. She told me about a nearby shelter, offered to walk me there. At first, I hesitated, pride and fear tangling inside me. But I had nowhere else to go. So I nodded. The walk felt longer than it probably was, each step heavy with exhaustion, but also with a small flicker of hope. When we arrived, the building looked plain, almost unremarkable. But to me, it felt like a doorway back into the world. Inside, there was warmth, quiet voices, the faint smell of food. It wasn't home, but it was something. That night, lying on a thin bed, wrapped in a clean blanket, I felt a sense of relief I hadn't felt in days. For the first time since everything fell apart, I slept without fear. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind began to wander through the years I had spent in my marriage. Memories came in waves, some soft, some painful, all heavy with meaning. I remembered the early days, when everything felt possible, when love seemed simple and unbreakable. But those memories slowly gave way to others, the quiet moments of control, the decisions made without me, the times I was told to stay silent, to not make trouble, to accept things as they were. I had convinced myself that this was normal, that this was what marriage required. I had given up pieces of myself, one by one, until I no longer recognized who I was. Lying there, in that small bed in a shelter, I realized something that both terrified and freed me. Maybe I hadn't just lost my marriage. Maybe I had escaped something that had been slowly erasing me for years. It wasn't easy to accept. The pain was still there, the betrayal still fresh. But beneath it all, there was a quiet realization growing inside me that I had survived more than I ever acknowledged. And if I could survive that, maybe I could survive this too. The days at the shelter began to form a routine. I started helping in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, cleaning surfaces, doing whatever I could to stay occupied. It gave me a sense of purpose, something to hold on to as I tried to rebuild myself. People began to notice me, to greet me with small smiles, to thank me for my help. It wasn't much, but it mattered. Each day, I felt a little less invisible, a little more present in my own life. I wasn't just the woman who lost everything anymore. I was someone trying to start over, piece by piece. It was hard, of course. There were moments when the weight of everything would come crashing down on me, when I would sit alone and wonder how I had ended up here. But there were also moments of quiet strength, moments where I realized that I was still standing, still moving forward. At 74, starting over wasn't something I had ever imagined. But it was something I was doing, one small step at a time. One afternoon, as I was organizing supplies, the shelter manager approached me with an envelope. My name was written on it in a familiar handwriting. My heart skipped a beat as I took it, my fingers trembling slightly. It was from my son. I hadn't heard from him since before the divorce. I opened it slowly, afraid of what it might say, afraid of what it might not say. The words inside were simple, but they carried a weight that was hard to describe. He apologized. He said he hadn't known the full truth, that he had believed what he was told, that he was sorry for not being there. As I read, tears began to fall, blurring the words on the page. It wasn't a complete resolution, not a perfect ending. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was a step toward healing. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen. Not just as a victim of circumstance, but as a person who had endured, who had survived. And that feeling, as small as it might seem, meant everything. Weeks later, I found myself standing in a grocery store, carefully selecting a few items I could afford. Life had settled into a fragile kind of stability. I wasn't thriving, but I was surviving, and that was something I had learned to value deeply. As I turned down one of the aisles, I saw him. My ex-husband. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. My breath caught, my body tensed, old fears rising to the surface. He looked at me, his expression shifting from recognition to something like surprise. "You're still alive," he said, the words dripping with disbelief. A strange calm washed over me. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that he no longer held the power he once did. "Yes," I said quietly. "And stronger than ever." The words felt steady, true. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of him. Not because he had changed, but because I had. I walked away from that moment with a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Not because he apologized or understood, but because I no longer needed him to. Over time, the shelter offered me a small paid position. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I worked diligently, saving every dollar I could, slowly building something that was entirely mine. I bought small things for myself, clothes that fit, items that brought a bit of comfort. Each purchase felt like a quiet declaration of independence. Months passed, and one day, I found myself signing a lease for a tiny apartment. It wasn't grand, not even close. But it was mine. The first night I spent there, I sat on the floor, surrounded by bare walls, and felt a sense of accomplishment that was hard to put into words. After everything I had lost, I had managed to create something new. Something real. Months later, I sat by the window of that small apartment, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. The room was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with a sense of peace I had never truly known before. I thought about everything that had happened, about the words he had said to me that day outside the courthouse. "Live with your pride." At the time, they had felt like a curse. Now, they felt like something else entirely. Because I was living with my pride. Not the kind that isolates or hardens, but the kind that comes from knowing your worth, from surviving what should have broken you, from building a life on your own terms. At 74, I hadn't lost everything. I had found something far more important. I had found myself.